What we mean by valuing our elderly has probably changed a lot over time. In traditional societies, we looked to our elderly as the repositories of our society's history, its traditions, and its knowledge. They were our computer memory banks. They were the ones who had experienced and understood all of society's intricacies. As time went on, the elderly were less and less important for that purpose. So books first became available, and in books you could write down scientific facts, traditions, society's history. And you didn't need the memory of the elderly as much to remind you of those things. And of course, when we get to the modern day, we seem not to need the elderly for that at all. We have enormous repositories of information in computers and books. And so we ask ourselves, what does it mean to value the elderly today? And aside from the simple importance of elderly being human beings who have wants and needs and desires and feelings that we as other human beings need to respect and help nurture, and aside from the fact that when we say the elderly, we're really talking about our parents and grandparents and our love for them, the social question of their function, whatever that would mean in a society, may have changed. And my suggestion is that though the elderly may have lost their traditional role as the repositories of knowledge, they still have their traditional role as fonts of wisdom. Their experience, their lived experience of the decades and great events and social moments that preceded the birth of the people who could benefit by them are extraordinarily important for us to respect, because out of that experience comes a perspective that youth doesn't have. And so my suggestion is we need to value our elderly for the wisdom that they can give us to guide us through some of the really important decisions that we have to make in modern society. Just because my mother or grandmother may need some help operating her computer does not mean that she doesn't have a deeper understanding of how sitting in front of a computer, of how interacting with others through a computer screen may not be the most productive way to develop oneself as a human being. We can draw from our elderly enormous value through depending on them as a check and a balance against the excesses of youth. And so I think that's how we should value our elderly. We've changed remarkably in recent times in our willingness to cater to the elderly. We have retirement communities and activities that we never had before. But what that tends to do often is to isolate them from interactions with the younger generation, especially in our incredibly mobile society. And so I think as a society we do need to make an effort to mix the generations a little more so that the younger generations can benefit from the wisdom of their elders. In bioethics, the term dignity is bandied about a lot without people really thinking deeply about what it means. You know, historically, a French medieval scholar and historian named Philippe Ariz wrote a book about the stages of death throughout history. Tamed death is what he called the first stage in ancient times, when people expected death to come and it was incorporated into the society. Then there was a stage called my own death, when people discovered selfhood, in a sense, historically, individuality, and for the first time we see grave markers with individuals' names on them. And there were other phases too. The last phase, before the one we're in now, was called hidden death, where we put death in hospitals and we closed the curtain and death was hidden away from society. The stage I think we're in now, I call controlled death. Today our goal is to decide how we're going to die, when we're going to die, under what circumstances, in some cases even initiating our own death through physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia. So what we mean by a dignified death has changed over time. And today what we tend to mean by it is a death that I control in my own way, where I'm not stuck in a hospital bed with needles and tubes going into me under the control of someone else. Is that really what we want a dignified death to be? That is what society is deciding right now. That's what the debates about physician-assisted suicide are about right now. What does it mean to have a dignified death? Does that mean just a death where others treat you with deference, or does it mean a death where you get to decide the nature, timing, and circumstances of your own death? Researchers are making enormous strides in brain-computer interfaces, and there are two major kinds. One is called augmented cognition, and that involves creating computers that can actually interact with human beings. We have very limited memories, attention, discernment. When we try to make decisions, when we're piloting a plane or when we're working on a complex task, our brains can only incorporate finite amounts of information. The idea of augmented cognition is to supplement that, for a computer to be able to see how a human being is acting and then reacting to that human being's needs. So I don't think there's a major issue with augmented cognition. But the second piece of BCIs, or brain-computer interfaces, is what we call neuroprosthetics. And that involves actually using computers to supplement damage into the function of the brain. And there we're actually talking about, in many cases, implanting computer chips into the brain or creating an interface, a physical hardwired interface between the brain and a computer through implanting electrodes that are connected to a computer. And that can be used to help paraplegics and quadriplegics manipulate their environment. It can be used for, or they hope it will be able to be used for, people who have lesions or tumors in the brain that disrupt function. Then we're talking about, for the first time in history, having brains and information technology working together in an integrated way. The good news about that is that brain plasticity allows that, and we may find that these neuroprosthetics help people in profound ways. An example of that would be cochlear implants. The problem is, once you begin to supplement the natural function of our brains with artificially created information technologies, you're risking a whole host of problems, from competition between the two forms of information, to malfunction of the information technology, to a kind of deep psychological difficulty in understanding that my own thought processes are no longer only mine, but involve some sort of silicon chip that has now been fully integrated into me. Because after all, unlike genetics, even though we spend a lot of time thinking about that, we think of our brains as uniquely us. My identical twin can share my genetics, but my brain is mine. And when we begin to manipulate the brain, whether it's through BCIs or pharmaceuticals or in any way, we are beginning to alter, in some sense, that which we think of as most uniquely ourselves. And we have to do it with great caution. Brain imaging research is advancing at a startling pace. For a long time, I kept predicting that this research was going to hit a wall and stop, and it hasn't. So I've stopped thinking that there's a natural boundary to this research. What they are doing now is having people think of objects, intentions, and other normal functions of the brain. And through brain imaging, they are able to predict what that person is thinking of, sometimes with startling accuracy. Certainly, if you have someone think of one object rather than another, a hammer or a chair, brain imaging can now, after getting a baseline, predict with great accuracy which one you're thinking of. There's research that showed out of Berlin that if you ask someone to add or subtract two numbers together and you brain image them once they've decided, but before they've revealed it to you, you can predict with great accuracy which one they have done. which one they've decided to do. So what we have now is the possibility that brain imaging will at some point be able to actually get fairly detailed and robust predictions or recognitions of what a person is thinking of. Now this has profound implications for forensics. Courtrooms would love this kind of ability. They are working very hard on a brain imaging lie detector, and there are now 2 companies that actually offer brain imaging lie detection to the public. The question of putting someone in a scanner to try to determine guilt or innocence, or to try to decide if they were at the scene of a crime, they're also using EEG besides brain imaging for that, has become a very controversial issue in legal channels, and I don't think that there really is any consensus about how this can and should be used. But even outside of the courtroom, there are some very interesting implications of this. I have 2 teenage daughters. If I come home one day and my car is dented and both of them said they didn't do it, will I be able to drag them off to one of these new lie detection companies and say, get in the scanner, I want to know which one of you dented the car? Would schools be able to use that for drug searches? Will companies be able to use that? We all saw Minority Report when Tom Cruise walks into the store and the scanners in the store know who he is, what he likes to buy, what he bought the last time he was there. There really is a privacy issue here that we as a society are going to have to make a decision about. One quick example that I think will illustrate how different this is from similar issues that came before. According to our Constitution, I have a right against self-incrimination. What that means legally, though, is not I have a right to deny you my DNA if a court orders it, or a hair sample. The court can take those from me, even though they may incriminate me, because the Constitution gives us a right against, the Fifth Amendment actually, against testimonial self-incrimination. You can't force me to testify against myself, which includes pointing at something, gesturing. Any action that I do that involves revealing my thought to you is considered testimonial. Well, what if you could read my brain and get a piece of evidence that could be used against me? Is that testimonial evidence? Well, I haven't testified. Or is that more like blood, semen, DNA, which they can take from me even though I don't want them to? The answer is it's not like either of those things. It's a new ability that we have as human beings, and at some point the courts are going to have to decide, is brain imaging a protected kind of testimonial evidence, or is it a picture on a scanner that should be considered the same way we consider other physical evidence that I don't have a right to withhold? That's one example of the thorny kinds of questions that this technology is going to bring. The stem cell debate has been a fascinating debate in our society for a number of reasons. For example, we always thought that the abortion debate was pretty set. There was a group pro-choice, group pro-life, and it was very easy to determine which groups were in which camp. Then stem cells came along, which are really based on the same moral objection, that an embryo should be treated as a human being and that a human being should not be destroyed. But what you saw for the first time was people crossing camps. So you had a number of people in Congress, Orrin Hatch and Strom Thurmond and others, who were very strongly in the anti-abortion camp, who were also very strongly in the pro-stem cell camp. You had some religious groups that were against abortion when the fetus was in a woman's uterus, but who said a cell in a dish is not the same thing. So you had important schisms there in this endless abortion debate that we've been having for over 30 years in this society. And that is actually a hopeful thing. It shows that perhaps by breaking through some of those traditional barriers, we can begin to talk more about compromise not only on stem cells, but also on abortion. However, the bottom line on the stem cell debate is, unlike the abortion debate, it is going to go away. And it's going to go away because science is in the process of, and there's some successes in this already, being able to create stem cells without having to destroy embryos. And since the destruction of the embryos was really the only objection against stem cell research, once science masters the ability to create stem cells that do everything embryonic stem cells do without destroying embryos, that debate will go away, assuming that science achieves that. They're very close. They haven't quite gotten there yet. Ethics involves scholars from across the intellectual spectrum, so philosophers and social scientists, and then in bioethics you have clinicians, you have lawyers and nurses, and you've got economists, and you've got political activists. Ethics involves people who approach it from a scholarly perspective, those who approach it from a very sort of pragmatic social perspective. So what ethics really is a conversation. And to point to a few things that are somehow innovative in ethics is to ask the question of what's innovative in our society that has ethical implications. So, for example, there's a lot of ethical discussion right now about the proper use of the web, Twitter, Facebook, and other kinds of information technologies. And the question of whether that should be government controlled, should there be regulation there, should it be controlled by the people? There are ethical questions around our economy. Of course, the big one we're dealing with as we tape this is healthcare reform. And there are some very innovative kinds of suggestions that have been made by ethicists and others about how we might get around the roadblocks of healthcare reform. And in fact, the President's bioethics commissions, both President Clinton and President Bush's, have worked hard on these kinds of issues. One of the things that interests me, of course, is biotechnologies. And there we have some fascinating issues and questions about how we are going to change ourselves. Human enhancement has become a very big question for those of us thinking about how is technology going to alter the nature of being human, what it's going to mean for our abilities, how are our children as they go through school best considered with attention-enhancing drugs available now, with memory-enhancing drugs coming out soon. Is it a boon to our children, or is it somehow diminishing their developmental capabilities to give them drugs that will enhance their capabilities in school? We now have abilities to predict the onset, for example, of mental illness in ways we haven't before. Some work being done here at Emory has suggested that in children as young as elementary school, we might be able to see some beginning signs of susceptibility to schizophrenia. And then the big ethical question is, what do we do about it? Do we give them a kind of prophylactic psychiatric medication? Well, the medications for schizophrenia, while they're very important for people who have it, are not nice medications, and you don't want to give them to children, especially without being able to say this child will definitely become mentally ill. So what we have now is an explosion in biotechnology. We are able to manipulate the plasms and the functions of the body in a way that just a few years ago were almost inconceivable. And we have to ask ourselves, should we do it, how should we do it, and under what circumstances? And that, by the way, is where the question of wisdom versus knowledge actually comes in. Because the answers to these questions don't involve gathering more facts. They involve thinking deeply about those things that are of most importance to us and deciding how we can sustain and maintain those things even as we use biotechnology for its best purposes.